A lone Marine haunted by the death of his best friend in Afghanistan finds himself lost in the Appalachian Mountains. When a blizzard uncovers traces of a long-buried secret bunker, he stumbles into evidence of betrayal at the highest level. What he uncovers could change everything, but it might cost him his life. Stay with us as we follow Ethan's journey of pain, loyalty, and redemption. If stories like this move, you make sure to subscribe and share it. Helps us bring more untold tales to light. Ethan Cole was 29 years old, but in the dim light of his small apartment, he often looked both younger and older than that number suggested. Younger in the smoothness of his face, when the shadows softened it, older in the weariness that lived behind his eyes. He was a former Marine discharged 3 years ago after Afghanistan had taken more from him than he ever admitted. The town he lived in, tucked into the Appalachian Mountains, was quiet and unambitious, the sort of place where a man could vanish without much explanation. Dry Creek, they called it, though no one could quite remember why. For Ethan, it was less a home than a hiding place. The apartment smelled faintly of old wood and cigarette smoke from whoever had lived there before. He hadn't tried to change that. The furniture was secondhand, a sagging couch, a table with one leg braced by folded cardboard, a bed that groaned when he lay down. On the table that night lay his old Marine Corps uniform pulled from the back of the closet. He didn't wear it anymore. It wasn't meant for men like him now. Still, he spread the jacket flat across the table, as though smoothing out wrinkles could press back time itself. Beside the jacket was an envelope, creased and yellowing at the corners. He didn't need to open it. He had memorized the words. It was the letter that told him Sergeant Michael Reyes had died on a mission gone wrong in Afghanistan. His closest friend, the man who had kept him laughing in the dust, the one who covered him in firefights and shared cigarettes on cold desert nights. Michael was gone, and Ethan had been there when it happened. The bulletins and the reports all called it a casualty of war, but Ethan knew better. He blamed himself, convinced that he had moved too slowly, that he had failed to shield his friend. Every night, the memory replayed in fragments gunfire, echoing off stone dust clouding the air. Reyes's voice, shouting his name, and then cutting off like a radio gone dead. He would wake drenched in sweat, his chest hammering, and the silence of the small apartment would press down heavier than the dream. The people of Dry Creek had stopped asking about him after the first year. At first, they called him Soldier when he came to buy groceries, or sat in the diner alone. Later, when he turned down offers to join hunting trips or church socials, when he kept his answers short and his gaze lowered, they gave up. Now he was the quiet one. They left him be, and he was grateful. His days were shapeless. He picked up small jobs until his temper, or his inability to focus, drove him away. The VA checks kept him just above hunger, and when he had a little extra, he spent it on whiskey or rye. The bottle was easier than sleep. Most nights he sat by the window with a glass, staring into the darkness of the mountains, feeling as if he were waiting for something, but not knowing what. Tonight was no different. Snow swept against the glass, the first edge of a storm they said would last days. Ethan sat in the thin glow of a single lamp, turning the letter over in his hand, tracing the seal with his thumb. His uniform jacket stared back at him from the table ribbons dull under the low light. The room was cold, even with the radiator clanking. He pulled his sweatshirt tighter, but the chill came from deeper than the walls. It was the cold that lived inside him. He thought about Reyes, about the last words he had heard. He thought about the ambush, the deafening blast, the choking dust. He thought about how he had promised Reyes's mother when he flew back stateside that her son hadn't suffered. That was a lie. Michael's eyes in that last second haunted him, filled with both pain and trust. Ethan had broken that trust, or so he believed. Sometimes he wondered if dying there might have been easier than carrying this weight. He had medals tucked away in a drawer, but he hadn't looked at them in years. They felt obscene, shiny tokens pinned on a man, hollowed out inside. He didn't feel like a Marine anymore. He didn't feel like anything. The whiskey bottle was nearly empty. He poured what was left into a chipped glass, stared at the amber liquid as though it might hold an answer. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. In town, lights were going out one by one, but here no one would notice if his went dark for good. He raised the glass, then set it down untouched. For a long time he sat still, listening to the storm, his hand resting on the folded uniform. He thought about putting it away again, but he couldn't. Part of him needed it out, needed to see what he once was, even if it only sharpened the reminder of what he had lost. He thought about Michael's laugh about the sound of boots crunching in the desert at dawn. The memories were both comfort and curse. Ethan leaned back in the chair, exhaustion pressing on him, and closed his eyes. In the silence between gusts of wind, the apartment seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the mountains, far past the snow, and the cold life went on. But for Ethan, Cole, life had ended 3 years ago in a valley of stone and blood. What remained was a shell sitting alone in Dry Creek, waiting for nothing. The storm arrived with no mercy, a wall of white sweeping down the spine of the Appalachians until the mountains themselves disappeared behind curtains of snow. By evening, the power was gone, the lines sagging under ice, and Dry Creek vanished into the dark like a town erased from a map. In his apartment, Ethan sat with his back against the wall, the lamp that had given him comfort now a dead weight of glass and metal. The cold crept through the thin windows, brushing against his skin until his bones ached. He pulled the field jacket tighter around him, but it felt less like protection and more like a reminder that he was alone. He did not light a candle. He thought briefly of letting the flame burn small and warm, but decided against it. A candle was hope, and he had little use for that anymore. The letter and the uniform remained on the table, dim shapes barely visible. They felt like company in the way tombstones keep vigil over the dead. Ethan leaned his head back, eyes closed, and listened to the howl of the wind as it clawed at the roof and rattled the frame. Every sound in the storm seemed to echo his mind, violent, restless, impossible to quiet. He thought about letting go, about lying down on the couch and letting the night take him. Death did not scare him. It was the waiting, the endless parade of mornings and nights that gnawed at him like slow fire. He shifted, trying to find comfort in the shadows, but nothing settled. The silence between gusts carried weight, and his breathing sounded too loud in the dark. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, as if darkness could cancel darkness. He whispered Michael's name once softly, and the sound startled him. He had not spoken it aloud in months. The storm answered with a groan against the walls. He told himself to rest, that tomorrow would be another long gray day to endure, but sleep did not come. Instead, it was broken by something else. At first he thought it was part of the storm, some trick of ice against metal, or a branch scraping across the siding. It was faint, a tap carried by the wind, almost too soft to notice. He held his breath. There it was again, deliberate, sharp, against the vast noise of the blizzard. Tap. A pause. Tap. 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 His chest tightened. He waited for it to repeat, convinced his mind was weaving ghosts out of the storm, but the rhythm came again, steady and intentional. His training stirred like an old engine, reluctant to start. He counted the beats, the pauses. It was Morse code, too exact to dismiss. He pushed himself up from the floor joints, stiff with wold, and crossed to the window. Outside, the world was gone, erased by white. The streetlight had failed, leaving only the vague glow of snow illuminated by the distant reflection of the sky. The courtyard looked like an empty canvas, untouched, yet somewhere beyond the ridge came that sound again. He slid the window open a fraction, and the wind slapped against his face, sharp as glass. He leaned out, straining ears tuned to the smallest thread of noise. Tap, 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 tap. He clenched his jaw, the sound ringing too clean to ignore. His mind split in two directions. One voice told him it was only his PTSD, the storm feeding illusions into his ears. He had heard echoes before, doors slamming that weren't real, the phantom crack of gunfire in traffic. It could be nothing but his own head turning on him. The other voice, the one that had once guided him in combat, insisted otherwise. It told him to trust the discipline drilled into him, the instinct to separate chaos from signal. He had learned long ago that coincidence seldom repeated itself so precisely. He shut the window and leaned against it, heart steady rather than frantic. It was not fear he felt, but a pull, the weight of something unanswered. He paced the apartment once, twice, his breath clouding in the cold air. He told himself it was impossible that no one could be out there in weather like this, not at night, not miles from the road. And yet the rhythm lingered in his ears, insistent. He reached for the bottle on the table, lifted it, then set it back down, untouched. Alcohol dulled edges. Right now he needed every edge sharp. He went to the door and laid his hand against it, listening to the way the storm pressed against the building. He imagined walking out into it, snow wrapping around him, the cold gnawing him hollow. And he almost welcomed the thought. At least it would be decisive, a choice, rather than a slow unraveling. But the tapping changed everything. It had carried intent. It was as if someone had reached across the gulf of storm and silence and touched him. His chest rose and fell, controlled, measured. He turned back toward the table, the jacket lying in shadow. He brushed his fingers over it once more, a reminder of who he had been. He knew Morse knew rhythm, knew signal from noise. He could not pretend this was nothing. He found a notebook, the kind he used for shopping lists, and scribbled down the sequence as best he could recall. His handwriting was uneven in the cold, but the marks were enough to fix it in his memory. He sat again staring at the page, at the crude dashes and dots. The storm roared outside, but it no longer felt like the loudest thing in the night. His thoughts pressed forward, unwilling to let go of the possibility. Maybe it was only wind on a loose sheet of tin. Maybe it was ice breaking against rock. But if it wasn't, if it was real, then someone or something had called out through the storm, and he had heard it. He could not escape that knowledge now. The apartment felt smaller than ever. The air carried a tension heavy and expectant. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, though his blood was already moving faster, driven by something beyond cold. He thought of Reyes, of the look in his eyes before the world went dark in that Afghan valley. He thought of all the nights since waiting for nothing, and now for the first time he wondered if nothing had finally given way to something. He folded the paper carefully, placed it in his pocket, and sat still listening for the sound to return. The wind howled, the radiator clicked, and the dark pressed close. And beneath it all, faint and patient, came the rhythm again. Tap, 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 tap. The morning broke with a clarity so sharp it hurt his eyes. After a night of relentless wind and noise, the mountains had fallen utterly silent, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Ethan opened the door to his apartment, the hinges stiff with frost, and stepped out into a world transformed. Snow lay thick across the street, and rooftops pure and untouched, the storm's violence now smoothed into a deceptive calm. His boots sank deep as he moved, the cold biting through worn leather, the air crisp with the metallic tang that followed a storm. He pulled the collar of his jacket high, his breath rising in steady white clouds. The tapping from the night still pulsed at the edge of his memory, insistent, refusing to fade. He told himself he would look just for a moment, just to prove it had been nothing more than wind and imagination. Yet every step he took felt guided by a hand he could not see. He cut across the street toward the small rise that led to the woods, his eyes drawn to the ground, searching without knowing what for. At first there was nothing but endless white and the faint depressions where branches had collapsed under the weight of snow. Then, as the sun pushed over the ridgeline and scattered light across the drifts, something caught his eye. A spark, small but undeniable, flashing like a signal in the snow. He stopped, squinting, his body tense, as if it had recognized danger before his mind had caught up. Slowly, he bent down, brushing away the crust of ice with his gloved hand, and uncovered a shard of metal no larger than his palm. He lifted it carefully, turning it over in the weak light. Despite the rust, it was unmistakably a track link from a military vehicle designed for war. The air felt different now, charged, the silence no longer empty, but watchful. He looked around, the snow stretching white and innocent, yet the shard in his hand insisted otherwise. He scanned the slope rising behind the town, a rugged climb scattered with firs and oaks stripped bare. That was when he noticed it subtle at first, but once seen impossible to ignore. A long groove cut into the hillside, faint but clear in the morning light, a path where the snow had shifted unnaturally. It was too wide, too clean to be the mark of an animal or falling debris. It looked like weight had pressed it down, sliding, dragging something massive, moving where nothing should. Ethan's pulse quickened. His training stirred awake that old rhythm of assessment and calculation. He measured the angle of the slope with his eyes, gauged the depth of the impression. A vehicle, yes, but not one that should be here. Not one that could survive hidden for so long without someone knowing. He crouched low, letting his gloved fingers press against the compacted line of snow, feeling the subtle hardness beneath where the weight had frozen the earth tighter than its surroundings. It had been there before the storm, perhaps even years, but the blizzard had scoured loose layers away and revealed it like a scar. He rose, eyes sweeping the ridge, the trees, the jagged crown of the mountain above. His thoughts raced, the Morse-like tapping the fragment of track, the unnatural slide threads weaving together into something too precise to dismiss. It was not chance. It was not imagination. His chest ached with the sudden knowledge that whatever had happened up there was tied to the life he thought he had left behind. He pressed the shard into his pocket, its weight against his thigh, a reminder he could not ignore. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, then began to follow the line. His boots broke through the snow, each step sinking deep, his muscles protesting but his focus sharpening. The slope demanded effort, but the Marine in him welcomed it. With every step upward, he shed something of the man who had spent years drowning in grief. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, yet he moved with purpose, drawn to the mark on the earth, like a tether, pulling him into the mountain's heart. He knew he should stop, that this was nothing more than a relic, some forgotten machine left to rot, but instinct whispered otherwise. He had trusted instinct, once trusted it with his life, and though it had cost him, it had also kept him alive. The trees thickened shadows stretching long across the snow, but the groove remained, leading him higher. At one bend he paused, scanning the white expanse, searching for any further trace. His breath came harsh in the still air, his skin burning with the cold, yet he felt more awake than he had in years. Something waited at the end of this trail, something hidden beneath layers of ice and silence. He could almost hear Michael's voice in the back of his mind, urging him forward, telling him not to turn away now. He pressed on boots, crunching the shard of metal heavy in his pocket. The groove curved toward a cluster of boulders half buried beneath drifts, and the snow there looked different again, disturbed, uneven. He knelt, brushing the surface, and found another faint depression, leading beyond the rocks, narrow and deliberate. His breath hitched. This was not nature's work. This was path movement intention, the kind of sign a soldier could recognize even years later. The cold gnawed at his fingers. The wind whispered down from the ridge, but Ethan barely noticed. His entire focus had narrowed to the line leading into the mountain, and the certainty that it was not finished. It was a call the kind you could ignore only if you were willing to live blind. He stood, eyes fixed on the hidden trail, and tightened the jacket around him. Whatever waited beyond those rocks, he knew it would not be simple, but he also knew he could not turn back. He stepped forward, following the mark into the trees, each footfall carrying him deeper into the silence of the mountain. The trail led Ethan higher into the mountain, until the trees thinned and the snow deepened, a silent white corridor framed by jagged stone. The groove in the snow had grown fainter with each step, but it never vanished entirely, guiding him like a faint scar left on the earth. The morning light had shifted to a dull gray clouds closing in again, and the air had that brittle stillness that comes just before another storm. His breath burned in his lungs, his thighs aching from the climb, but he did not stop. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man trained to endure, scanning ahead for the next sign, his gloved hand brushing the rock for balance. As he rounded a bend, the groove curved sharply and disappeared into a narrow gap between two towering walls of granite. He slowed, studying the gap. It was no more than 3 feet wide at the base, widening slightly as it rose a slit in the mountain, that the wind funneled through in low, mournful gusts. Snow had drifted inside, half burying the entrance, but he could see where something heavy had once been dragged through. He adjusted his pack and squeezed into the crevice, his shoulder scraping stone. The light dimmed as the walls closed around him, and the temperature dropped, the air damp and metallic. Halfway through, the snow under his boots shifted. He tried to steady himself, but his foot slipped and he slid down a short incline hidden beneath the drift. He hit hard, his shoulder slamming into something solid and unyielding. Pain flared sharp and cold as he rolled onto his back, staring up at a strip of pale sky framed by the jagged rock above. He lay still for a moment, catching his breath, then pushed himself up on one elbow. The object he had struck was not stone. His glove brushed it again, and he felt the unmistakable chill of metal beneath a crust of ice. He wiped the snow away with quick, sure motions, revealing a flat surface of steel mottled with rust. As the snow fell away, lines began to emerge, faint at first, then sharper, the raised outline of an emblem. His heart clenched as he recognized it, the eagle globe and anchor of the United States Marine Corps, the very insignia he had once worn on his chest. He stared at it, his breath catching as memories rose, dust-heat rotor blades, and Michael's voice over gunfire. He pressed his palm flat against the emblem, the metal biting at his skin even through the glove, and felt a tremor run through him. This was not a relic of strangers. This was a mark of his own life, a chapter he had tried to bury. He crouched, searching the edges of the plate, and found a seam hidden under layers of frost. A door, heavy and long forgotten, sealed into the mountain. He dug at the snow with his hands until a handle appeared, rusted but intact. He grasped it, pulling hard. At first, it resisted the hinges frozen by years of neglect. But then, with a low groan, it shifted, opening inward a fraction. A stale, cold breath of air exhaled from the darkness beyond, smelling of old metal and stone. He pushed again, muscles straining until the door swung wide enough to slip through. Inside, the world changed. The light from the doorway stretched into a cavernous space reinforced with steel beams and concrete walls. His boots echoed softly on the floor as he stepped in, the sound swallowed by the hush of long abandonment. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of oil and dust. The ceiling arched low, lined with pipes and faded hazard markings, and the walls bore the ghostly outlines of equipment long removed. It was a bunker built for endurance, a remnant of the Cold War carved into the mountain, and then forgotten. He could almost hear the hum of generators that no longer ran, the murmur of voices long gone. He moved slowly, flashlight in hand, now its weak beam slicing through the gloom. In one corner, half hidden under a collapsed shelf, a stack of old crates sat covered in dust and ice. Most were stenciled with faded numbers, indecipherable after decades, but one stood apart. It was smaller, heavier, its surface marked not by standard codes, but by a name carved directly into the metal, with a steady hand: Michael Reyes. The sight rooted him to the spot. He reached out, tracing the letters with his gloved fingers, the edges rough but deliberate. His throat tightened. He knelt, tugging at the latch. It opened with a reluctant squeal, revealing a simple interior lined with foam. Inside lay no weapons, no papers. Instead, a black USB drive rested there, sealed inside a waterproof plastic bag with silica packets to keep it dry, its casing scratched but intact. The placement was deliberate. Michael, in the final months before his last mission, had arranged for it to be hidden here through a trusted contact who knew of the old bunker, trusting Ethan might one day find it. He lifted it as if it were made of glass, the small object shockingly warm against his cold skin. For a moment, he simply held it, staring, the memories crashing over him. Michael's grin under a desert sun, the sound of his laugh, the look in his eyes the night everything went wrong. On a nearby table stood an old laptop, its plastic yellowed with age. Michael had clearly refurbished it himself and wired it into a portable generator he had hidden in the bunker, the faint hum of its engine still alive in the walls. Someone had clearly maintained this place long after the war, though for what purpose, Ethan could only guess. He brushed snow from its keyboard, plugged in the USB, with hands that trembled and pressed the power button. The machine groaned, a faint whir of fans rising, and the screen flickered to life in a dim glow. It loaded slowly, painfully, as if reluctant to reveal what it held. Then, a single file appeared unnamed. He clicked it. The screen went black, then filled with a grainy image. Michael's face emerged from the static, pale, under harsh fluorescent light. He looked older than Ethan remembered, his eyes ringed with exhaustion but burning with urgency. His voice came through thin and uneven, yet clear enough to cut through the years. "If Ethan is watching this," he said, pausing, swallowing hard, "then I'm probably gone. We were betrayed. It wasn't the enemy who found us. It was the people we were sent to protect. They sold our position." His eyes flicked off-screen, then back, fierce and unflinching. "They're not done. They'll come for anyone who knows. You have to understand." The video glitched, freezing for a heartbeat before resuming, Michael leaning closer, as if he could reach through the screen. "If you found this, you're the only one left who can finish it. You're the only one I trust." Ethan's hands clenched, the edge of the table knuckles white. The glow of the screen lit his face, carving every line of shock and grief into sharp relief. The bunker seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the echo of his friend's voice, a voice pulled from death into the present. The USB drive blinked faintly in the dark, a small heartbeat of light. Outside, the wind began to rise again, rattling the old door. The screen flickered, the grainy image of Michael frozen for a moment before dissolving into static. Ethan sat motionless, his hand still hovering near the keyboard, his breath uneven. The bunker seemed to hum with silence, the weight of his friend's words pressing down like the cold stone above. He forced himself to move to click through the remaining directories on the drive. The laptop wheezed as if resisting its fan, straining against years of dust, but slowly the folders opened. Inside were files labeled in code strings of numbers and acronyms that meant nothing at first glance. He clicked one, and the screen filled with spreadsheets, rows of dates, account numbers, and transfer amounts. Offshore banks, shell corporations' payments hidden under layers of bureaucracy. Ethan scrolled his mind, racing every column, a blade cutting deeper. Another file opened to scanned documents, contracts written in the precise legal language of the defense industry. He recognized some of the names corporations that had built bases overseas, companies that had profited from every extension of the conflict. His eyes narrowed as he traced the signatures, the seals of approval from officials who had claimed loyalty to their country while selling its secrets. The contracts mapped a chain of deceit intelligence fed to the Taliban in exchange for promises of reconstruction projects, lucrative deals to rebuild what war had destroyed. The circle was complete death, traded for profit, betrayal, masked as strategy. Ethan's jaw tightened. He clicked again, finding a folder of maps marked with red circles, coordinates written in shorthand familiar only to soldiers. They were routes his unit had once patrolled, valleys and ridges seared into his memory. Next to each was a notation, times and dates of ambushes. His hand hovered above the screen, trembling as he realized the truth. Those ambushes had not been luck or skill on the part of the enemy. They had been orchestrated, handed to them on a silver plate by men in suits thousands of miles away. He leaned back, pressing a hand to his face, the cold glove rough against his skin. Michael had known. That was why he had left the message, why he had hidden the drive here in the belly of the mountain. He had stumbled onto the truth, and the truth had killed him. Ethan rose, suddenly pacing the length of the bunker. His boots echoed on the concrete, the sound harsh in the emptiness. He wanted to deny it, to believe that the files were fabrications, that Michael had been mistaken, but the detail was too precise. Every contract bore real names. Every transfer carried dates that aligned with blood spilled in the valleys of Afghanistan. He saw himself there again, crouched in the dust, radio crackling with static as bullets tore overhead. He remembered the weight of Michael's hand shoving him toward cover, remembered the sudden silence after the blast. He had blamed himself for 3 years, convinced he had failed his friend, but now he knew the truth was darker. It had never been his failure, it had been betrayal. He returned to the table, his eyes fixed on the screen as more files opened. Reports written by analysts, their language clinical and detached. Anticipated casualty rates, one line read acceptable in relation to projected contract value. Ethan's stomach turned, bile rising in his throat. He scrolled faster, needing to see more, needing to burn the proof into his mind even as it seared his heart. Photographs appeared, blurry images of men in suits shaking hands with known insurgent leaders, the briefcases between them heavy with cash. The captions bore code names, but the faces were clear enough. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles whitened. Every instinct told him to smash the machine, to bury the evidence so it would stop poisoning him. But he forced himself to remain still. This was bigger than his pain. Michael had died to reveal this, and Ethan could not let it vanish into silence. He copied the files, each transfer slow, the ancient laptop grinding with effort, as if aware of the weight of what it carried. He watched the progress bars creep forward, every percentage point, a measure of justice clawed from the grave. When the final transfer finished, he sat back down, staring at the blinking cursor. His reflection wavered faintly in the dark screen, a gaunt face with eyes too old for his years. He thought of the people back home who had decorated their porches with flags, who had believed their sons and daughters were fighting for honor. He thought of the empty chairs at kitchens across the country, the folded flags handed to mothers and wives. And he thought of the men who had orchestrated it, counting profits while the ground drank blood. The silence in the bunker deepened his breath, the only sound. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the old rhythm of his heart, steady yet heavy. For 3 years he had been lost in guilt, drowning in the memory of Michael's death. Now he knew the truth. Michael had not died in vain, and his death had not been random. He had died because he had seen through the lie, because he had carried a truth that powerful men would kill to bury. Ethan closed his eyes, his fingers still resting on the warm plastic of the drive. The world outside was quiet, the snow lying heavy, but inside his mind, a storm had begun fiercer than any blizzard. The files on the screen glowed faintly, a map of betrayal that demanded action, and for the first time in years he felt the stirrings of something dangerous purpose. The cursor blinked on the dim screen, its steady rhythm pulling Ethan forward. He had copied the files, but copies meant little if they remained locked inside this mountain. The truth had to escape, had to breathe, or Michael's death would remain a secret buried under stone. He dug through the tangle of cables and found a satellite uplink module clearly installed years later, its dish hidden in the mountainside. It was wired to a dormant power line that activated only when the bunker's generator was switched on. His hands hesitated, the weight of choice pressing down on him, before he connected the drive and began the process of uploading. The laptop groaned, its fan rising, its screen trembling with static as the first data packets leapt outward. For a moment there was only silence, the soft tick of progress inching forward across the ancient display. Then the bunker itself seemed to stir. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, then steadied with an unnatural hum. The air vibrated with a low frequency that pressed against his chest like invisible hands. A sound rose from the walls, a pulsing tone, not mechanical failure, but something else, something alive. Ethan straightened, his instincts firing. He knew the feel of being seen, of being hunted, and the sensation now was undeniable. He bent over the keyboard, checking the connection. The data rate fluctuated wildly, numbers rising and collapsing, as if another force were pressing against it. Lines of code flashed across the screen faster than he could read commands, not his own worming into the system. His breath slowed his focus, narrowing every part of him, aware that he had triggered something. His mind traced back through the files, through Michael's warning. They had known. They had prepared for this. Somewhere far away, someone had felt his presence like a vibration on a web. Above him, the fluorescent tubes buzzed and dimmed shadows stretching across the concrete walls. The pipes groaned, the sound echoing like a distant engine. Ethan gripped the edge of the table, his eyes darting to the heavy steel door at the bunker's entrance. The low hum thickened into a steady rumble the way the air feels before a storm breaks. The hair on his arms rose. Something was moving in the digital dark, searching, reaching. He yanked the cable free. The screen froze mid-command, the last line of text cut short. For a moment, everything went still again, as if the intrusion had been severed. Then the alarm began. A deep rolling siren filled the bunker, vibrating through the floor, its voice mechanical and ancient. Red lights flared to life in the corners, spinning beams that painted the walls with frantic motion. Ethan's pulse hammered his body, already moving, scanning the chamber for threats. He had triggered a response, but from where? He pressed his back to the cold wall, breathing, slow eyes sweeping the room. The alarms were not random. They had purpose, each one escalating in pitch, each one carrying urgency. He thought of Michael's words of betrayal, of enemies hidden behind familiar faces. If the files were real, if the evidence was true, then he had just placed himself in their crosshairs. He could almost feel the gaze of men in distant offices, eyes narrowing as they watched a signal bloom in their networks. Outside faint at first, but growing came a different sound. It began as a tremor, a vibration that shook loose snow from the beams, then deepened into the unmistakable thump of rotor blades. Ethan froze his head, tilting towards the ceiling. The sound grew stronger, closer, the steady rhythm of military craft slicing through the mountain air. A helicopter. Not one, but several, the cadence overlapping into a pounding storm. His jaw set the truth clear. They were coming. He darted back to the table, shoving the drive into his pocket, pulling the strap of his rifle tight across his chest. His eyes flicked to the monitors, to the faint traces of external sensors still alive in the system. Static crackled, then resolved into ghostly images, heat signatures moving swiftly through the sky, descending in formation. He counted them automatically, 6, maybe 8 men. Their posture, their spacing, their discipline told him what he needed to know. These were not scouts or police. These were professionals, hired blades, the kind sent when silence had to be permanent. The bunker shuddered as the first helicopter swept low its searchlight, cutting across the mountainside. Dust and snow fell from the ceiling, the air vibrating with the force of turbines. Ethan crouched his mind, racing through possibilities. The door was thick steel built to resist, but nothing was impenetrable. If they had tracked him here, if they had the resources of a defense giant behind them, then they would come with the means to tear the mountain open. The siren cut off abruptly, plunging the bunker into a heavy silence broken only by the fading echo of rotors. Ethan's breath fogged in the cold air, his hand gripping the rifle stock, his body poised. The red lights continued to spin, casting long shadows that twisted like figures across the walls. He knew the silence was not safety. It was the pause before impact, the moment when predators circle unseen. He tightened the strap of his pack, the metal shard from the mountainside pressing against his thigh, a reminder of the path that had led him here. The low rumble returned deeper, now closer, vibrating through the floor as boots touched down outside. He imagined them moving in formation, weapons ready, their breath masked by night vision goggles. The old instincts surged, the calculations snapping into place. He had been out of the field for years, but the body never forgets. He slid into the shadows, back pressed to the cold concrete, listening. Each sound mattered. Each second stretched. Somewhere in the dark, above a helicopter's searchlight, passed across the ridge, spilling light through the narrow seam of the door. The beam wavered, then moved on, leaving the bunker in darkness once more. Ethan exhaled slowly, steady his pulse in rhythm with the silence. Danger was no longer distant, no longer abstract. It was here, moving closer, step by step. And the mountain that had hidden the truth for years was about to become a battlefield. The faint tremor of boots outside the mountain swelled into deliberate movement, a cadence too disciplined to be mistaken for chance. Ethan crept back to the command station, the glow of the old monitors casting pale light across his face. He brushed dust from the largest screen, pressed a key, and the system sputtered to life, grainy feeds flickering into view. Michael had left behind more than files. In the final months before his death, He had secretly reinstalled a network of hidden cameras around the ridge, giving Ethan an eye on the mountain. The images were faint and distorted, but they were enough. Shapes appeared, spectral figures cutting through the snow with precision. 8 men, dressed in black tactical gear rifles, held low but ready their helmets, smooth under the sweep of the helicopter lights. They moved like shadows, given form their spacing, exact their posture, revealing training far beyond common soldiers. Ethan studied them, reading the language of their movement the way another man might read a book. This was no scattered team of thugs. These were professionals, contracted ghosts whose work was silence. He leaned closer, watching as they spread outward, forming a perimeter along the base of the ridge. Each one carried more than weapons. Heavy packs were slung across their backs, the kind designed to hold tools of intrusion rather than sustenance. He knew what would come next, even before he saw it. On the feed from the western slope, 2 men knelt in the snow, pulling a device from its case. A wide rectangular unit, sleek and dark, its wheels pressing into the ice. They pushed it forward slowly, scanning the ground beneath. Ground-penetrating radar. Ethan's breath caught the reality, sharp and final. On another screen, a man drove spiked rods into the snow with steady strikes, each one sending vibrations into the earth. Seismic sensors, they were building a picture of the mountain's belly layer by layer, searching for the hollow that should not exist. The bunker had survived decades of secrecy, but against technology like this time was the only defense. Hours at most, and the illusion of stone would fail. Ethan clenched his jaw, eyes flicking from feed to feed. He recognized the tactics, the way they advanced methodically, their arcs overlapping, each man covering the blind spots of another. They were tightening a net, each step reducing the ground he could claim as safe. He had faced enemies in the desert who fought with fury and chaos, but these men brought none of that. They brought silence, discipline, inevitability. He sat back, his rifle across his lap, the glow of the monitors painting shadows across the room. To fight them head-on would be suicide. He had once been trained for battles like that, but alone in a rusting bunker against 8 professionals, the outcome was certain. Michael had left the cameras for a reason, not as weapons, but as warnings. The only path forward was not confrontation, but endurance. Buy time. Protect the evidence. Preserve the truth long enough for it to escape. He opened another screen, scanning the old systems for any remaining tools. Most of the bunker's functions had long since died, their circuits corroded, their machinery rusted into silence. Yet a few commands still responded. Small indicators blinked, relics of defensive measures that might still hold some power. Tripwire sensors along the outer ridge, a few non-lethal deterrents built into the approach paths. Nothing that could win a war, but enough to confuse. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He imagined the mercenaries moving like chess pieces across the mountain, their technology peeling away the lies of stone, their discipline closing in. He had to think differently, to be the ghost in the dark, to stretch every minute into an hour. His mind moved with the clarity of old training, the part of him that had lain dormant since Afghanistan now awake, not dulled but sharpened by years of silence. On the northern feed, one of the men paused, his head tilting as if he sensed the cameras. He gestured with 2 fingers, and another approached, planting a small dish into the snow. Ethan's stomach turned as he recognized it. A signal analyzer, its job to sniff for transmissions, to hunt the faintest pulse of electronic life. The bunker was not broadcasting, but its heart still beat faintly, its ancient circuits leaving traces. He could only hope the age of the equipment masked its signature. He sat in the glow, the hum of the servers beneath his palms, listening to the distant thrum of helicopter blades circling overhead. The air inside the bunker felt heavier, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. He rubbed the metal shard in his pocket, grounding himself, remembering the path that had led him here. The trail of betrayal carved in steel. Michael's voice echoed in his head, warning him, trusting him. Outside, the men moved steadily, like wolves circling prey they knew could not escape. Each camera feed showed the net drawing tighter, their gear humming softly as it scanned their faces, unreadable behind tinted visors. Ethan's heart beat in slow, measured rhythm. He could not stop them. Not yet. All he could do was wait, watch, and prepare for the moment when waiting ended. The monitors still glowed faintly, showing the mercenaries tightening their circle, but Ethan no longer needed them to know what was coming. The low whine of equipment outside the shifting shadows across the narrow seam of the door, the silence that follows deliberate men, it all told him the same truth. They were ready to breach. He forced himself to breathe evenly, eyes scanning the room for anything he could use. The bunker was old, its systems failing but not empty. He pulled open storage crates, brushed away dust, and found scraps of survival spools, of wire boxes, of rusted nails, cracked glass bottles. At the bottom of one crate lay 2 grenades, their paint faded, but pins still intact. He cradled them for a moment, remembering the desert, the roar of explosions, the faces of men who had never come home. These were not tools of victory, but of delay, and delay was all he needed. He moved quickly, his hand steady despite the pounding of his heart. He strung wire across the corridor leading to the steel door, attaching it to nails hammered into the concrete. The lines crisscrossed like a spider's web, invisible in the dim light. He rigged one grenade to the wire, not as a killing blow, but as a flash, and thunder meant to disorient. Into bottles, he poured fuel from an old canister, stuffing rags into their mouths, crude fire in fragile glass. Every motion was muscle memory, training carried out in silence, his mind clear, his body moving like it had in another life. The thud came then, heavy and final, as something struck the outer door. The steel shuddered dust raining from the ceiling. Another strike followed, deeper, more deliberate. They had brought breaching tools, and the bunker's defenses would not hold long. Ethan crouched, gripping his rifle, eyes locked on the corridor. He did not want to kill them. Not these men who were only following orders, but he could not let them pour inside unchecked. His purpose was survival, not vengeance. The files in his pocket burned like a brand against his leg, reminding him of why he was still standing. The door gave a long groan, the sound of metal bending under force. Then came the crash, the final strike that knocked it inward with a scream of tortured hinges. Light from outside slashed into the dark, stark white beams cutting across the concrete. Figures surged through black silhouettes against the glow. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then the wire snapped taut. The grenade ignited with a blinding flash, thunder cracking against the walls. The blast was not lethal, but overwhelming the narrow space, magnifying its roar. The mercenaries staggered, some falling hands flying to helmets, rifles clattering against the floor. Smoke and dust filled the air, the acrid sting of powder choking the narrow passage. Ethan seized the moment. He hurled one bottle, the glass shattering near the door flame, blooming hungrily across the ground. The heat surged outward, a wall of light and smoke forcing them back. He turned, ignoring the sting in his lungs, and dropped into the escape shaft he had uncovered earlier. The tunnel yawned narrow and black earth cold against his palms as he crawled forward. Behind him, shouts echoed, muffled, disoriented the sound of men regrouping after chaos. The tunnel pressed close, forcing him onto his elbows, every movement a scrape against stone. His shoulder struck hard against the jagged wall, pain flaring white-hot. He bit down, pushing forward, but warmth spread beneath his jacket, wet and heavy. He did not need to look to know the skin had torn. Each pull forward left a smear on the stone, the blood seeping into his uniform. His breath grew ragged, every inhale tasting of iron and dust, but he kept moving, dragging himself deeper into the dark. The tunnel bent sharply, and he collapsed against the wall chest, heaving. His hand pressed to the wound, the fabric-soaked fingers slick. He could feel his strength leaking out with every beat of his heart, but still he listened. Still, he measured the distance of the footsteps echoing behind him. They were slower now, cautious. The explosion had done its work. They would not rush blindly into a tunnel that might collapse at any moment. They would regroup, analyze, and advance carefully. That was time, precious minutes Michael had given him through foresight, minutes he could not waste. He pushed himself forward again, crawling through the choke of the tunnel until at last it widened, opening into another chamber. He slumped against the wall, sweat freezing on his skin, the pain in his shoulder a steady drumbeat. In front of him stood a narrow doorway leading back into the control room, the place where Michael's face had first appeared on the flickering screen. Ethan stumbled through each step unsteady and collapsed into the chair at the console. The monitors still glowed faintly, their grainy feeds showing the mercenaries regrouping outside the breach. Some knelt in the snow, scanning the flames with thermal gear, while others moved with cautious precision along the perimeter. Their movements were slower now, deliberate, as if the mountain itself had reminded them it could bite back. Ethan leaned forward, his blood-soaked sleeve sticking to the armrest, his breath fogging in the cold air. He pressed trembling fingers against the console, feeling the hum of the old machine beneath his skin. This was where Michael had sat, where he had recorded his last words, where he had decided that truth was worth his life. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the faint buzz of the electronics, the distant thrum of rotors above, and the echo of his friend's voice still alive in the static of memory. He was bleeding, cornered, hunted, but he was not yet finished. The evidence was still with him, the files still alive, and as long as that was true, so was his purpose. Ethan's vision blurred the edges of the control room, tilting as if the bunker itself swayed with the rhythm of his fading heartbeat. Summoning the last reserves of strength, his hands trembled violently. Each keystroke a desperate act clawed from fading consciousness. He pulled the battered USB from his pocket, the same one he had recovered from Michael's rusted locker. The small drive slick with his own blood as he pushed it into the console's port. The machine stuttered to life with a tired whir, and the cursor blinked like a fragile heartbeat waiting to be answered. He navigated through the files, his fingers trembling over the keys, and found the secured line Michael had hidden deep in the system, a direct channel encrypted with layers of codes Ethan barely understood, but trusted because it bore Michael's mark. He typed the address, the name burned into his memory. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who had once walked alongside their unit in the dust of Afghanistan, the woman who had sat by the fire, listening to their stories, promising she would never let their voices be buried. Ethan's breath caught as he hit the final command, and the screen filled with progress bars that crawled upward like the slow climb of a mountain. The system groaned under the weight of data, but held firm, each file a piece of betrayal. Each transfer a nail driven into the coffin of the corporation that had traded their lives for profit. His wound pulsed with every second, hot waves spreading through his chest, but he kept his eyes locked on the screen, as though by sheer will he could force the machine to complete its task. And the message appeared in stark white letters against the dark background. Transmission complete. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt a surge of quiet triumph, a moment where Michael's voice echoed not in memory, but in victory. Yet the relief was fleeting, because almost instantly alarms shrieked through the bunker. The screens flashing with intrusion warnings, his act of defiance had not gone unseen. The enemy had been watching the digital air like hawks, and the second the files flew outward, the predators had traced the flare back to its source. Unbeknownst to the mercenaries, the FBI had been quietly monitoring suspicious defense contracts for weeks. When Ethan's transmission triggered the hidden beacon Michael had embedded in the files, they moved without delay, deploying forces already staged nearby for such an operation. Ethan's chest tightened as heavy boots pounded against steel. The echo of men moving in formation rifles raised tactical lights, slicing through the smoke and dust. The door that had barely survived his traps shuddered again, then burst open under the force of practiced hands. Shadows filled the threshold, black figures cutting across the pale glow of the monitors, their weapons leveled as one, and in that frozen instant, Ethan knew he could not fight them all. He gripped his sidearm anyway, not from hope of victory, but from the instinct of a soldier who had never surrendered, his arm heavy but steady as he raised the pistol toward the intruders. The room seemed to contract, the sound of his breath louder than the alarm's time stretching, as he closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable storm of fire that would end him. But instead of the expected crack of rifles came the thunder of rotors above, deeper and heavier than the corporate birds that had brought the mercenaries. The whole mountain seemed to vibrate as new lights tore through the storm clouds outside, flooding the snow in stark white. Then, a commanding voice boomed over loudspeakers. "Federal agents, stand down, drop your weapons." Confusion fractured the mercenaries' precision. Some turned, others froze their hesitation, snapping like brittle glass, when flashbangs erupted outside, sharp bursts of light and sound rolling through the mountain pass. The mercenaries faltered, their formation unraveling under the sudden pressure. Ethan's blurry eyes widened. He realized the reinforcements had not come by accident. Michael's foresight reached even further than he had imagined. Buried in the files, hidden in the very act of transmission, had been a beacon, a dormant alarm waiting for the right trigger. The data Ethan had just sent had lit it like a flare in the night sky, calling not only Sarah, but the silent watchers of the government who had monitored whispers of betrayal for years. The FBI had moved swift and relentless, and now they descended upon the very storm meant to silence him. Chaos engulfed the bunker, shouts of surrender, mixing with the clash of gear. Ethan tried to rise, but the strength poured out of him as quickly as the blood soaking his uniform. He staggered, the pistol slipping from his hand, his vision dimming until the world became a haze of flashing lights and echoing commands. The last image burning into his mind before the darkness took him was the sight of armed agents flooding the corridor, their vests marked with bold white letters, their rifles not aimed at him, but at the mercenaries who had come to end his story. Ethan's knees buckled, and he fell against the cold steel floor, the chill of it spreading through his cheek, his body too heavy to move. His blood pooling outward in a widening halo, and as his consciousness slipped, he thought he felt a hand on his shoulder. Not real, but imagined. Michael's steady grip guiding him as it had on patrols long ago. And with that thought, the darkness claimed him. The sky above Arlington stretched wide and pale, the early spring air crisp yet softened by the scent of new grass pushing through the soil. Rows upon rows of white headstones gleamed under the morning sun, like silent sentinels, their symmetry both beautiful and unbearable. Ethan Cole leaned heavily on the steel crutch tucked beneath his right arm, his left leg wrapped still in the brace that told of shrapnel and torn muscle that would never quite heal. His uniform was pressed with careful precision, though the fabric strained where bandages still wrapped his ribs. Each step across the gravel path carried the weight of months of recovery, and of a truth that had remade his world. Reporters had written his name in headlines, but he had avoided their clamor, preferring silence to spectacle. And now he stood at last where he had long feared to come, in front of a stone etched with the name Michael Reyes, his closest friend. The brother whose laughter still echoed in his mind. During sleepless nights, Ethan's breath caught as he lowered himself carefully to one knee. Balancing awkwardly on the crutch in his hand, he held a small, folded American flag, its fabric stained faintly dark at one corner. Ethan had never washed it, preserving the mark from the ambush 3 years ago. For years it had been too painful to even look at, but now it was an offering. For years it had been a wound he could not look upon, now it was an offering. Ethan pressed the flag gently against the cold marble, his fingers trembling as he whispered, "You did not die in vain, Mike. You brought me back to life." His voice cracked under the weight of tears he had long refused to shed, the sound of his own words startling him with their honesty for months. Since the raid, he had walked the narrow path of survival, stitched together by surgeons, interviewed by agents, questioned by journalists. Every retelling of Michael's foresight and sacrifice had felt like reopening the wound, yet now the wound felt like it could finally close. The nation had watched in disbelief as the powerful Defense Corporation crumbled under the evidence he had delivered. Their executives paraded in handcuffs, their assets seized, hearings broadcast across every screen. Ethan had stayed away from it all, but he knew Michael's name was spoken there, cleared and honored, his unit's reputation restored. No longer shadows lost to whispers of failure, now remembered as heroes betrayed and redeemed. Ethan bowed his head as a bugle's clear, mournful notes rose in the distance. A funeral for another soldier drifted across the cemetery. The sound threaded through the morning air like a lament, not for one man, but for all of them. Ethan's shoulders shook, tears slipping freely down his scarred face. But woven into his grief was something unfamiliar, a fragile thread of peace. He remembered Michael's last video, the fierce light in his eyes as he spoke of betrayal and duty. And Ethan realized that his friend had not only uncovered corruption, but had left a path back for him, back to purpose, back to life. The crutch bit into his arm as he struggled to stand fully upright again, his chest aching but his posture firm. He raised his hand in a trembling salute, his fingers brushing the edge of his brow in the gesture that had defined so many years of service. The salute lingered, his tears blurring the name carved into stone. And when he let his hand fall, he felt a release, as though Michael himself had accepted it. Nearby families moved quietly among the graves, placing flowers, touching names, whispering prayers, but Ethan barely noticed the world had narrowed to the single marker before him. And the knowledge that Michael's story had not ended in silence, that truth had risen and justice had been done, and that Ethan himself, once broken, had found the strength to carry it forward. He lowered his gaze, a small smile trembling across his lips through the tears, fragile yet real. The first smile in years, not born of memory but of hope. The weight he had carried for so long seemed lighter. Not gone, never gone, but bearable. Like the scarred leg he leaned upon, part of him, yet not all of him. Ethan whispered one final time, his words barely louder than the breeze stirring the trees. "Thank you, brother. I'll live for both of us now." The bugle's last note hung in the air, fading into silence, and in that silence Ethan felt reborn, his grief and his joy intertwined. His tears falling freely, yet his heart steady, a soldier once shattered, now standing again, not as the shadow of war, but as a man who had been given back to life. If this story moved you, I'd be grateful if you could support by subscribing and sharing it. Helps these stories find their way to more people who might need them. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Which part of Ethan's journey struck you the most? And where are you watching from today? Your comments mean a lot and keep this community growing.